Hello, everyone. My name is Asya Darbinian, and I'm the Executive Director of Chhange, Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, housed at Brookdale Community College in Lincroft, New Jersey, on the territory of Lenni Lenape people. Welcome to Chhange's virtual Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day program in memory of Arsen Harutyunyan. Today, April 24th, marks 109 years since the Ottoman government's order to round up, arrest, and deport Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, then the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Many of them were brutally murdered shortly after. By deliberately liquidating the prominent, influential Armenians first, the Turkish government deprived the Armenian community of its leadership and its uniting force. It was the beginning of the Armenian genocide, orchestrated and systematically implemented by the Ottoman state against its Armenian subjects. That's why in Armenia and among the Armenian communities around the world, April 24th is marked as the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. It is the day when we remember and honor 1.5 million victims of the Armenian genocide. We also reflect on the resilience of those who survived and the perseverance of their children, grandchildren, who built new lives here in the United States and around the world. As we all know, 109 years later, the Armenian nation is once again in danger. Azerbaijan's brutal attack on Artsakh and the ethnic cleansing of its indigenous Armenian population in September 2023 resulted in a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Over 100,000 Artsakh Armenians became refugees, and Azerbaijan did not stop there. Today, the Armenian state and Armenian people are not safe yet again. That's why tonight's program is titled Remembrance in a Time of Calamity, to reflect on these more recent challenges the Armenian nation is facing. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items regarding tonight's program. You will see that your audio is muted, and it will remain muted throughout the program. The chat box is enabled, so feel free to communicate with each other via chat, but please make sure to send the questions for our speakers directly to me and not to the general chat box or to the speakers. That way I will be able to see all of your questions, and at the end of their presentations, I will pose those questions to our guests. And before we begin, I would like to thank Chhange's staff, Suzanne Esterman and Rachel McCauley, for all the help with setting up and running this Zoom program. We're grateful to Adrian and Richard McComber for their continued support of our Armenian Genocide Remembrance program. A warm thank you to our sponsors, Karen Petrosian Richardson, Samson and Valerie Budakians, Howard and Pamela Dorman, John and Murray Haitayan, Susan Yakubian Klein, Tallinn and Ara McComber, Arpine and Eric McQueen, David and Sosi Najarian, as well as to our donors and members for your continued support. Tonight, we are fortunate to have with us not one, but 3 amazing speakers who join us from Australia, Armenia, and New Jersey. First, we will hear from Dr. Khatchig Mouradian, who is currently in Australia. Dr. Mouradian is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University and the Armenian and Georgian area specialist in the African and Middle Eastern division at the Library of Congress. He also serves as co-principal investigator of the Project on Armenian Genocide Denial at the Global Institute for Advanced Study at NYU. He is the author of the award-winning book, The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria in 1915-18. Dr. Mouradian received his PhD in history from the Stresser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Dr. Mouradian Khatchig is not only my colleague and friend, but also a longtime friend of Chhange. As a matter of fact, yesterday was the 10th anniversary of Khatchig's first presentation at Chhange. Armine Mosiyan joins us from Yerevan, Armenia next to share her and her family's history. Born and raised in Artsakh, Armine was 4 when she lost her father, Mirjan Mosiyan, in the First Artsakh Liberation War. After high school, she attended Yerevan State University in Armenia's capital, where she received her bachelor's and master's in international relations. After graduation, Armine moved back to her hometown of Stepanakert, the capital of Artsakh, where she worked at the office of the President of the Republic of Artsakh. In 2016, Armine spent a semester in the United States within the framework of the Davidian Scholarship Program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And that is how I had the pleasure of meeting Armine, and I'm fortunate to call her a friend. Despite her young age of 34, Armine has seen 4 wars, survived a 9-month-long blockade, and witnessed an ethnic cleansing, the result of which was that she and her family were forcibly displaced from, in her own words, her happy paradise. Armine is currently based in Yerevan with her husband and 3 sons. And last but not least, our third speaker today is Dr. Kim Hekimian, joining us from New Jersey. We caught her right in time. She's traveling to Armenia tomorrow. An associate professor of nutrition in pediatrics and the Institute of Human Nutrition at Columbia University Medical Center, she is the director of IHN's Master of Science in Nutrition program. Dr. Hekimian is also the Associate Director of Education for the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons program in Education in Global and Population Health. In spring 2020, Dr. Hekimian co-organized the Public Health Working Group for Armenia during the time of COVID-19. This group of epidemiologists, biostatisticians, public health policymakers, and risk communication experts from academic centers around the globe supports efforts of the Ministry of Health of the Republic of Armenia in health system strengthening activities. Currently, Dr. Hekimian is an advisor to the Minister of Health of Armenia. And interestingly enough, what brought Kim and I together was the Armenian Genocide Remembrance program held in North Jersey 5 years ago, where Kim was one of the organizers and I was invited to speak. Thank you all for being here with us today. Now I will mute myself and turn it over to our first speaker, to Khatchig.
Thank you, Asya, for the introduction. Chhange is an institution that, as you mentioned, I have been working with, involved with, and present at for more than a decade now. And I was very happy to visit Chhange just a couple weeks ago again. And I see it as one of those foundational, important institutions for educating about genocide and human rights. I myself have seen many hundreds of students who have participated in programs and exhibits at Chhange. So it's a pleasure to be here. But let me be very clear about how at least I see my role here. I very much look forward to hearing from Armine and Kim. And the way I see my role is sort of offering some introductory remarks that connect the Armenian genocide with today and reflect on that. In that context, perhaps it would be best for me to start with this photograph that has haunted me since 2020. This is a photograph taken by an Associated Press journalist who, uh, during the 44-day war on Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, was essentially took this photo of an Armenian uh, driving a truck, literally carrying their home on the truck as they escaped Nagorno-Karabakh. This image has stayed with me ever since, and I have perhaps used it at talks and presentations for dozens of times. And it really, I believe, captures the Armenian experience, and of course, the experience of many other groups that have faced expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. It captured this sense of displacement, this sense of as we are forced to leave the lands, our ancestral lands, we often carry shards, bits of memories of our home. Sometimes it actually comes in the shape of the home itself, but for most people, it is only little bits and pieces of what they can salvage, in addition to the many memories that they carry with them. We will hear later from, uh, two wonderful co-panelists who have had a lot more direct interaction and experience with loss and those who experienced loss and of a homeland, of an entire life in Artsakh and up in Armenia. But I'd like to share just a couple of very quick interactions that I've had with Armenians from Artsakh that are really etched in my memory. One of them is actually a Facebook post that I saw in a mutual aid group on Facebook created for and by Artsakh Armenians. So this is a Facebook mutual aid group where hundreds of Armenians who have been displaced from Artsakh and are currently based in Armenia post about some of their needs, and there are others who essentially try to help them as much as possible. These are things as simple as or as complicated as paperwork, or also some families needing a heater or blankets and so on. And as I follow this page, one post several months ago really stood out for me. This was not someone asking about documents or how to go about securing certain documentation. It was not someone who was trying to receive some kind of assistance. It was a man who posted a picture of 2 bags. And he said, I lost these 2 bags on my way as I was forced to leave Artsakh on my way to Armenia. And he says, the most important things in my life are in these 2 bags. They are photographs of my family and my time in Artsakh. And for some reason, in the depth of that loss and grief, that was tremendous. That sometimes we can't really put to words. Sometimes we think about in terms of numbers. Sometimes we think about in terms of the loss of land. That man's loss of his photographs, his family photographs, touched me very deeply. And because in many ways, it is a reflection of how we experience the world and how we try to make sense of it, and the way in which oftentimes what looks like small losses are and can be, in fact, tremendous traumatic experiences. The second story is one that will stay with me as well. And as I was having a conversation with someone, again, displaced from Artsakh, he told me that his mother was a scholar in Artsakh and a professor in Artsakh, and she was forced to leave without taking a single one of her books from her library there. And he was telling me how every time in Yerevan that he's walking past one of the old used bookstores, he looks through the books, trying to find one or more books that his mother had back in Artsakh, in hopes of reconstituting her library. Again, It is emblematic of the experience of those who have lost so much and are trying to, bit by bit, rebuild it, oftentimes from scratch, and oftentimes in an era where they feel not seen, in an era where they feel that their voices are not being heard, and at a time when there's so much conflict, war, that news cycles, even when there is any kind of coverage, are moving extremely fast, leaving a lot of people behind. One of the things that I'd like to note here is that genocide casts a very long shadow. And this shadow is one under which Armenians have lived and have tried to emerge out of for 109 years now. This impacts the Armenian culture, the Armenian homeland, as well as the lives of Armenians, the survivors of the genocide and their descendants. One, perhaps again, quick emblematic example would be these 5 monasteries that are in modern-day Turkey on the border with Armenia. This is a region that was called Khatchig in historic Armenia. These 5 monasteries were built between the 9th and 13th centuries. And they survived the genocide, unlike many hundreds of churches, monasteries, and schools all over the Ottoman Empire. But they did not survive the destruction campaign, the cultural destruction campaign unleashed by the Turkish state in the decades since. In the 1940s, the Turkish military arrives in this region, cordons off the area, and fills all 5 monasteries with explosives and blows them up. I'd like you to pay attention to the monastery, the largest one in this picture, to your right. And today, from that explosion, all that remains, I've visited this site several times over the past 15 years, all that remains is this one monastery standing. It is terribly scarred, as you can see, and the scars are even deeper on the inside. And it is in the midst of this cemetery of Armenian cross stones and this cemetery of pieces of stones from the other 4 monasteries that were completely destroyed. And in many ways, this destruction is continuing today in a different form in Azerbaijan, in Artsakh, where after forcing the Armenian population out, we are witnessing on a weekly basis reports from projects and institutions that are following this, including the Caucasus Heritage Watch, that by using satellite imagery is tracking the destruction of cultural heritage in Artsakh. Every week, there are reports of the destruction of a church, the desecration of another site, and there is this constant traumatization and re-traumatization of Armenians that sort of makes it impossible to emerge and try to move on from under the shadow of this particular loss and destruction. Mind you, again, to put this in a broader context and just give a sense of the loss that Armenians are feeling, there's 2 things that are important to highlight. One is that for many Armenians, this last episode of exile, destruction, and loss of homeland is inextricably connected to the experience of the Armenian genocide and its legacy and its long shadow that has manifested itself in Turkey with denial for 109 years, with cultural destruction and silencing and threats for the past 109 years. And the absolute support, diplomatic, military, and otherwise, that the Turkish state offered Azerbaijan as it unleashed this last episode has only strengthened that feeling of threat and that feeling of continuity over the last 109 years. But another point worth emphasizing is that in this region of Artsakh, a millennial, a region where Armenians have lived for centuries, for millennia, the fact that today there's not a single Armenian living is testament to the way in which the scope of this loss and the way in which it happened, and the brutality and the silence of the international community. I say this because this is a region that over the past 2 millennia, just in the past, beginning in the 10th and 11th centuries, right, has witnessed wave after wave of, attacks and invasions. And despite all of that, right, all the violence that one may imagine and think of in the context of the medieval period or earlier, right, has never created circumstances under which all Armenians left those lands. And the fact that today, in the 21st century, that is the reality on the ground, is testament to the frustrating, and that would be an understatement, circumstances that that we are confronting in what we think about as an international order that has been indifferent, often offering very little more than lip service, and that is again a critical point to emphasize. Now, I want to sort of say a few more words just for context and then conclude. One is that this is not some kind of conflict where we have, it's easy to ascribe to some ancient, hatreds, right? This is a region that that was populated continuously by Armenians, as I mentioned. In Soviet times, the region was essentially placed under Azerbaijan as the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. So it did have some autonomy, but it was within Soviet Azerbaijan. This was a period over decades where, of course, it wasn't easy, it wasn't possible to engage in violence, outright violence against populations. But Armenians under Azerbaijan, particularly Nagorno-Karabakh, faced tremendous hardship challenges, particularly in terms of the suppression of culture and religion. And so there was this constant sense of being, of othering, right? And as towards the end of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union was nearing collapse, right, this started manifesting itself in different ways. Armenians felt increasingly threatened. This is a period, late 1980s, early 1990s, where pogroms, outright violence, and at the same time, a desire for self-determination essentially marked the Armenian experience in Artsakh. And it is from this period that Armenians decided to push back and demand autonomy and independence. That became a reality with the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, where the Armenians of Artsakh essentially fought and liberated the land of their ancestors, and that remained a reality after a ceasefire that ended the war until the 2020 war. In this context, though, it's worth noting that for many Armenians today, when they speak about their experiences of trauma and loss and shock, when they think and commemorate the Armenian genocide under these circumstances, and you'll hear more about this from a number of perspectives in a few minutes, it's important to think about it as not a story solely of loss and destruction. I showed earlier this image of the monastery, and when I look at this is how I think about the Armenian genocide as well. Yes, the Armenian genocide is about the death of 1.5 million Armenians. It is about the loss of a historic homeland. It is about the loss of Armenian culture. But at the same time, that is only half the story. The other half is about resilience and resistance. And it's an integral part of the way in which Armenians survived and Armenians thrived and rebuilt their communities, reconstituted their homeland, have an independent Armenia today, and are able to tell their story. So when I think about the generation that fought back, the generation that did their utmost to rebuild the Armenian communities after the Armenian genocide, under tremendous and extremely harsh conditions, at a time after World War I that was in modern Armenian history the most difficult and challenging, I'm confident, I realize that if that generation under those circumstances, with that level of total abject loss and extremely limited resources, if they could rebuild their lives and they could reconstitute or create new realities on the ground, I very much believe that if they could do it then, we can do it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khatchig. I want to remind our audience that please, if you have any questions, write it in the chat box to me, and then I will post the questions towards the end of the presentations. And now it's Armine's turn to share her personal history with us. Armine, the stage is yours.
Well, though it is late night in Armenia, I will say good evening to everyone. And before I start, I would like to thank Asya for inviting me to talk today about Artsakh and for a kind introduction. And thank you, Chhange, for providing that kind of platform. This is the first time I'm speaking about Artsakh publicly, about my life in and now unfortunately out of Artsakh, and in that sense I'm a little bit emotional. The previous panelist, Khatchig, has presented the history of Artsakh struggles for existence and the consequences of the forced displacement of more than 120,000 Artsakh Armenians into the Republic of Armenia. Today I'm going to tell you the story of my own families, the family where I was born and raised and the family I later created. As Russian famous author Lev Tolstoy starts his famous book Anna Karenina, happy families are all like, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Unfortunately, in the last 35 years, Armenians have seen 4 wars with different durations and different outcomes. Every family has a loss or losses in one of these 4 wars. Moreover, there were families that lost everything to the war. My talk today is shaped around me and my family's experiences during those 4 wars. I will begin with the first Artsakh Liberation War of 1988 and 1994. The conflict between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, I say that is officially 1 year older than me. And when I say officially, because a desire to rejoin with Mother Armenia was always there during the Soviet time, and only in 1988 an official appeal was made. Unfortunately, what followed was the tragic series of pogroms of Armenians in Azerbaijan, in Sumgait, Baku, and Kirilabad. The late 80s was also the beginning of my mother and my father's relationship. The first days of the demonstrations at Stepanakert Renaissance Square brought them together. They were both students at the time, and my mother, who is from Syunik region, was going to return home after graduation. Instead, she chose to stay in Artsakh and fight for a common goal. My father was a student in the Faculty of History. He was a member of Artsakh Central Committee of Dashnak Tutun, or ARF, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which, in the absence of an organized army, played a significant role in arming and protecting the civilian population. My father later became the commander of the Martuni Motorized Rifle Battalion No. 26 and participated in military operations not only in his native Martuni, but also in all regions of Artsakh. Those who knew my father knew how patriotic he was. And his victorious path would have continued if not August 23 of 1993. He perished on the day of his 5th wedding anniversary. And 8 months after my father died, the war was over, and my younger brother Merujan was born, thus bringing peace and a new light to our wounded family. He never saw our father, but resembles him a lot. The following years were very difficult for our family, especially for our mother, who now was both mother and father for us. But we lived with a great pride and dignity for what our father has done to our homeland, for our homeland. The relative peace with some border skirmishes lasted until the month of April of 2016. When this second brief war broke out, I was, as Asia mentioned, in the United States within the framework of the Tavitian Scholars Program. Now I don't remember how I reached home in 2 days, but to be honest, I felt safer at home rather than being in so many miles away. If during the war of 1990s I was a child and didn't understand what was happening and remembered the events by the stories of my mother and others, now I felt the smell of the war for the first time. Little did I know the more horrible days had yet to come. The third war broke out in September 2020. This war was different from previous wars in several ways. First, it started very spontaneously, and it was a full-scale war, making it impossible for women and kids to stay in Artsakh. That was when me and my 2 sons also left Artsakh until the end of this war. Despite this, many women stayed in Artsakh to secure the home front, while the soldiers were on the front line. Secondly, I was now responsible not only for myself, but for my 2 kids, who were only 3 and 1.5 years old, both sleeping peacefully at a time when the shelling of the capital city of Stepanakert started at 7 o'clock in the morning. You can see on pictures shared by me how our bedroom looked like after the bombardment of our house. Third, the chances of staying alive were meager, since the Azeris targeted the civilian population and cities. They also used such prohibited weapons as cluster bombs, which were banned under international law, and also white phosphorus, a devastating incendiary weapon. And for 44 days, our army and volunteers fought with dignity against not only the Azeris, but also against Turkey and against mercenaries from several Islamic countries. Words can describe the feelings we had at the time, waiting for a simple miracle. And when on November 9th that accursed ceasefire was signed, the first thought that came to my mind was how it's good my father didn't see all this. I wish I was dead not to see the outcome. We lost more than 4,000 brilliant young men. Many became disabled. Lots of families, lives, and hopes were destroyed. Most our historical lands, where indigenous Armenians lived for ages, were ceded to Azeris, the ones who were newcomers to the region and never possessed those territories. After the 44-day war, the decision to return home was inevitable. Our motherland was wounded, was broken, but as a child never leaves their sick parent alone, neither could do with our motherland. The return was very difficult, I would say, and brutal in the sense that the breath of war, sadness, and loss was everywhere, in houses, on the streets, and at workplace, in the eyes of everybody. There were young widows everywhere, orphan children, grieving parents. It was time when you felt guilty to even smile if something would happen in your life. Despite the after-war chaos, the state, Artsakh, mobilized its efforts to restore the normal pre-war life, to restore infrastructure, rebuild houses. With great difficulty, the life continued. Soon there were weddings held again, newborns' first cries were heard again. Many of the newborn boys were named after the heroic men who had fallen during the war. That was the time when our third boy, Robert, was born, who was named after a hero who had sacrificed his life to save the lives of his friends by shouldering them with his body. And there were so many heroic stories during this heroic war, one can't even imagine. Life continued more or less, if we can call it normal, until December 12, 2022. I'm not a superstitious person, but there were so many coincidences with the dates and events. It was on my middle son's birthday when Azerbaijan started the blockade of Artsakh, and the only road, corridor or Latin corridor that was connecting Artsakh with the outside world and Armenia was completely shut down. The next day, on December 13, the natural gas flows, which entered Artsakh from Armenia through a single pipeline running through Azerbaijani-controlled territory, was disrupted. And it was obvious that they did it deliberately in order to precipitate an energy crisis. Indeed, not even a month after the gas supply disruption, an accident was recorded in the only high-voltage energy line feeding Artsakh from Armenia. It was again done deliberately, and Azerbaijan did not restore it. Soon a decision was made to supply electricity to the Republic through local generating stations with certain restrictions. Here we had rolling blackouts, that is to say, power cuts for 2-3 hours every 6 hours. Can you imagine that? 21st century, winter, no gas, no electricity, which means no heating, cold houses, and freezing children, and of course, no hot meals. So what was it if not a genocide? Taking it to the legal language, Article 2.3 of 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime Genocide that says that defines the genocide says that genocide means not only killing members of the group or causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, but also deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Well, it was a genocide, and the whole world pretended not to be seeing it. The gas supply disruptions and rolling blackouts continued through the whole winter, making it impossible for educational institutions as well to operate. School, kindergartens, preschool groups, after-hour educational institutions all were closed for synody. Also, Artsakh was on the verge of running out of food supplies, as ICRC and the Russian peacekeeping mission based in Artsakh were the sole entities that delivered humanitarian assistance, including food and medicine. So a coupon system was introduced. It is when you go to a store and can't buy what you want. Instead, you buy what is left on the shelves and in what amount you are allowed to buy. For example, it was allowed to buy 1 kilogram, that is to say 2 pounds, of rice, pasta, buckwheat, lentil, and sugar per person per month, and that's it. Thousands of citizens were forced to stand in line for hours to get some minimal amount of food or basic necessities. The lines for bread were endless. Starting on June 15 of 2023, Artsakh was deprived even of the humanitarian assistance, as Azerbaijan completely banned any kind of humanitarian access to the country. Healthcare sector was also in disastrous condition. This basic right to medical assistance was also violated. One was even afraid to have a headache, as there weren't enough pills. I don't even mention those whose life depended on taking pills on every day. And in these disastrous conditions, new babies were born who lacked elementary necessities in the first days of their lives, be it diapers, baby formulas, also in some cases antibiotics. Later, Artsakh was announced a disaster zone and was the only area in the world that was in full isolation and siege, devoid of any humanitarian and international presence. Public transportation within Stepanakert, the capital of Artsakh, was also suspended. And in a week, buses that were connecting and Stepanakert with other towns and villages of Artsakh also stopped operating as well. It was no longer possible to deliver agricultural goods from rural regions to Stepanakert and other cities. The only good part, of public transportation being suspended was that we started to walk a lot. The total blockade continued until September 19, 2023. It was our youngest son's birthday. I managed to find several eggs, and some relatives and colleagues helped me with sugar, flour, and butter. Despite the severe conditions, we wanted to somehow make a little cake to make our son happy on his second birthday, I'm sorry. And at around 1:50 p.m., we heard sounds of bombing. We ran to the basement where we spent the whole night as the shelling of Stepanakert continued for the whole night. Even in this situation, the people that resisted hunger for almost 9 months were eager to defend their land and their homes, but it was obvious that Artsakh would not be able to confront the enemy on its own. The regions were cut from each other by the separate blockades of each region. No internet, no telecommunication were available, and this information vacuum was filled with aura. The enemy had its well-prepared plan to starve the population, to intimidate and threaten, then start a large-scale attack and take Artsakh by force. In 2 days, the active military operations ended, and it was announced that Artsakh and other representatives will meet to discuss the outcome. And the outcome was disbanding and disarming the remaining Artsakh army and full control of Azerbaijan over the region. It was clear that in such a situation, few of Artsakh residents were expected to stay in Artsakh because we could endure starvation, malnutrition, cold conditions, but we could not live under the rule of enemy who wanted our physical destruction. And the horrible part was when I realized that the war was over, that everything was over. And then I remember myself standing in the middle of our living room and crying. Honestly, I didn't know what to take with me. I didn't even want to take something with me in order not to disrupt the normal order of things. And there I stood trying to put our past, present, future, our life, our memories, and mostly our homeland in a suitcase and take it with me to nowhere, to the unknown future. That day, I lost my father for the second time. We reached Tech, that is a border village in Armenia, in 32 hours, while it was 1.5 hour drive usually. And in several days, 120,000 indigenous Armenians left their homeland. This was a classical ethnic cleansing and a genocide in front of the whole world, and the world was silent. But as I used to say, and as Asya mentioned, I see light in every situation. I'm convinced that we will return to Artsakh one day. Church bells will toll again in Artsakh, heralding the return of Armenians to their homeland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Armine, for sharing your story with us.
Thank you, Asya.
This is invaluable, and I admire you. I admire your courage and strength to put what you lived through into a narrative that can be shared with an audience. And knowing that you are doing this for the first time publicly, thank you so much. We're all really grateful that
Thank you too.
to join us, to share your family's history, your own personal experience. And it was also really emotional to see how, even though you did a great job of putting together and telling your story, not getting too emotional, yet the moment when we were all looking at your children's photograph with the candlelight was the moment when you could not stop your tears.
Yeah, right.
As you said, yes, you are a survivor of this horrible experience. You are a strong woman, but you are a mother. And that was the moment that you could not hold your tears. And it was
Right.
emotional for all of us, trust me. Thank you for sharing your story. Now it's Kim's turn to talk about her experience in working in Armenia and about the consequences of this population movement.
Thank you, Armine John, so very much for sharing with you something that personalizes what I'm going to talk about, which really is more about sort of the international evidence about what happens in public health to people who are suffering war and conflict and assault and blockade. So I'm going to share and go through some slides and see if I can sort of give a systems overview that that Armina's story just exemplifies so well. So I'm going to talk about Artsakh refugees. These are the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh and the public health in crisis. But obviously, I want to talk starting from the war and talk about these constructs that what impacts populations, war, blockade, assault, and so on. Artsakh had a very well-developed healthcare system and healthcare services. But in the 2020 war, there was a lot of bombardment of hospitals and clinics and loss of clinics and loss of physicians. And so health services overall had begun to suffer from that war. And even though there was some rebuilding in between the war and the blockade, health services overall for the overall population were harder to access. Medicines were harder to access, vaccines, again, physicians, certain specialties, and so on. My area of interest is in maternal and child health, and the most vulnerable in many ways in these situations tend to be women who are pregnant. Pregnant because either they're lacking in health services, lacking in the proper nutrition, lacking in the proper antenatal care. And what happens during pregnancy can often affect generations to come. And I will talk about that as well. Infancy is another very vulnerable time. Armina did speak about the issues regarding infant nutrition, infants who were born into hospitals that didn't have enough medicine and equipment and specialists, and then those for whom they could not exclusively breastfeed, the supplies of infant formula were also in jeopardy. And again, what happens during infancy is also a crucial time. And in fact, there is something called the 1,000 days of life starting in pregnancy going up to age 2. That's when about 80% of a person's brain is developed in those 1,000 days. And so what happens in those days also is extremely important. Childhoods, in terms of health, that's the area that I talk. I mean, Armina spoke about disruptions in disruptions in education and you know, sort of all kinds of psychological issues. In the health sphere, we're really concerned about lack of vaccines, lack of well checkups, lack of nutrition as well. When we have breakdowns in war and, you know, blockades, infectious disease tends to increase. We have refugees who are living in crowded spaces. We have people, as she showed you, living in these basement shelters. And again, with poor nutrition, with the stress of what's going on, the idea that infection can become, you know, more widespread is something that's quite evidence-based. Chronic disease, the profile of burden of disease in Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh is very similar to how it is in Armenia, which is not that different from how it is in the United States. The number one sort of causes of death and premature death are actually heart disease, diabetes, stroke, high blood pressure, and so on. So the fact that there was a breakdown in medications and a breakdown in health services meant that people with chronic diseases who had been able to manage them prior to this crisis were having challenges to do so. And in fact, Armina showed a photograph of the traffic on the road as people were fleeing from Artsakh. Just in that period of time on that road, 64 people died in their cars as they were trying to flee and get to safety in Armenia. And it's thought that the majority of those deaths are caused by the exacerbation of chronic disease that was poorly, or you know, there was no ability to manage well up to that moment. Water is always an issue. It's a very essential part of life, and people were scrambling to find water. There were people in Artsakh who were fearful that the Azeris were poisoning their water supplies. There wasn't bottled water any longer in the stores, and there wasn't fuel to be able to boil that water. And so water and then hygiene and sanitation together all are really important parts of public health that break down at these times and can have serious consequences. Housing, of course, is an important issue for everything else. Without housing, then you also have a breakdown of everything else. And right now, that is one of the most important factors in the recovery of the people from Artsakh who are now in Armenia, along with, of course, the management of psychosocial factors and trauma and mental health. This is not my area of expertise, but this is certainly the most compelling area for need in our population to help figure out how to manage some of the mental health issues that we have we know can help. And I have a slide on that coming up as well. But my area of interest is in nutrition and food and what happens you know, during these crises in public health. And I want to show a slide that shows the intergenerational consequences of undernutrition. And so we start in a life course. It's a life cycle, right? We start with pregnancy, and you know, a woman who's pregnant and malnourished can have an infant who is low birth weight. Low birth weight infants can become stunted children. Again, if there isn't the appropriate nutrients to reach them, they can become short for height. That can affect their cognitive development as well. A child who's stunted can become an adolescent who's stunted, and an adolescent who's stunted and grows to have a family of their own. That cycle of malnourishment can be intergenerational, and we have plenty of evidence to see from history where there have been other punitive blockades, like the Dutch famine in the 1944 and Ukraine's famine and others. We have multiple 3 generations of data on people to see that we do see changes in the epigenetics and long-term outcomes in metabolic disease as well. Luckily, we do know where we can intervene along the life course in order to stop that cycle. And my area, again, of focus and interest in my profession, but in this context as well as looking at ways of getting better diet and micronutrients to women when they are pregnant, to begin immediate initiation of breastfeeding and continue to give breastfeeding the optimal form of nutrition for as long as a woman and an infant are able to do so, and to continue that through to the children's ages, to get nutritious meals into children. Schools are a good way to do that, and then to bring that on up back to the next pregnancy. During the blockade, when the blockade happened, and infant formula supplies were in jeopardy, at that time, the population, approximately 50% of women were using formula. Many of them were mixed feeding, breastfeeding, and formula. That had been a societal norm, but with the lack of formula available, knowing that breast milk is sufficient and in fact optimal nutrition for children at least until the 6th month of age exclusively, I was peripherally involved in supporting a group called the Mom Center, and they quickly, rapidly responded to the needs by having telehealth of supporting infant feeding during this time, through Facebook Live, through individual consults, through Zoom, sessions. But of course, during the end of the blockade, even the internet and electricity was, were intermittent, broken for days. And so this ability to triage and do telehealth was also impacted. I call attention to something called the Sphere Handbook. It's a humanitarian charter and minimum standards for humanitarian response that was developed by the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. They coordinated this, and this was in the late 1990s. And it's founded, it's a series of guidelines for humanitarian assistance based on 2 core beliefs: that people affected by disaster or conflict have the right to live with dignity, and therefore the right to assistance, and that all possible steps should be taken to alleviate human suffering arising out of disaster or conflict. And this has been revised a number of times. And yet, as Armine pointed out, during this blockade, during the last 3 months in particular, no humanitarian assistance was allowed into this area. No humanitarian assistance at all for months on end. And the resilience of the people on the ground is incredible. And the stories that come out about how they helped each other, incredible. The types of things that we anticipated seeing as people crossed into the border, we thought we would see severe anemia among pregnant women. We thought we would see severe anemia among young children, and we didn't see it, because people triaged them and their vulnerabilities and shared what they could, and traded what they could to try to prioritize these most vulnerable populations. Really, these are stories of heroism. As you know, as Armine also said, and Khatchig before me, that by October of 2023, this is, the corridor through which people left the area that Armine is from, and they came into Armenia through this one road. And you saw that photograph of the cars and the traffic, a road that, as she said, should have taken typically an hour and a half to drive through, and people were there up to 40 hours on that road. As they came over, I was watching photos. These are all photos from press releases that I've seen online. But I, in my lens of maternal and child health, were thinking, what are they feeding these children? What do they have to eat? What are in these plastic bags that are being given to them along the way? What is this baby eating? And will the baby be okay and receive the nutrients that we wanted them to have? And I look for all of the bags of food, and I wonder what's in the food as they're coming across. People came in transportation through all modes, and as I said, took multiple days to get there. And as of the end of February, this is where the population of the forcibly displaced are now living in Armenia. So they have moved along the way from October when they first entered until this is a map of the end of February showing the population centers of where most of the displaced are. And so most are in either the capital city or the surrounding provinces. Armenia's population increased by 3.6% in less than 1 week. And so as a public health systems issue, right, they had to be integrated into Armenia's primary healthcare system. And as of February of 2024, more than 70,000 of the over 100,000 refugees have actually registered somewhere in a clinic. So they're sort of in the system, but the system itself is a very poor system sometimes, a very low quality, overburdened system. And so the challenges are to improve health systems strengthening are there. This is my second to last slide, Asya, so you know I'm finishing up. And I just want to make a plea for people who are involved in humanitarian assistance in this space that we have evidence base for what are the best practices for successful long-term outcomes for the refugees or the forcibly displaced. And what we know from long-term data that we see from the Armenian earthquake of 1988, we have follow-up data for 25 years after, and from the original refugees who came in from Baku in the very, very early 1990s, we have long-term data. And what we know is that communities that are resettled together, where we sponsor community resettlement for social support, we see better long-term outcomes. When housing is permanent, we see better long-term outcomes. Where people have employment and where we can have micro lending for people to restart their businesses, we see better outcomes. And finally, where people have access to cash transfer, where they have an EBT card with cash on it, where they decide what their family needs to buy, and they enter a store with dignity to choose what they want, rather than receiving a box of food that is pre-chosen for them, or rather than having to go through plastic bags of used clothing to choose something that fits them. This is the overall themes of what we know will be, will be supportive for the longer term successful outcomes for the displaced. But health specific, we need a lot more trauma informed care. We don't have a healthcare provider workforce that has any of that training, and we don't want our healthcare system to re-traumatize people. We need early access to quality health assessments and access to quality mental health services. And that is something that is lacking in Armenia. And finally, I just put up a map of the independent Republic of Armenia in 1920. And I say to all of you on this call that the Armenians have lost a lot, and they've lost a lot of land, and they've lost a lot of people, but they have not lost their spirit and their resilience. And on a day like today, I want to end by saying that I am certain that Armina and her family will continue to thrive, and they will do so because of the special nature of the people from Artsakh. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. This was a wonderful presentation and follow-up, continuing what Armina presented with some data and research that is amazing what you've been doing, and thank you for sharing that with us. And while you were bringing these examples and talking about what was for instance, surprising, right? When you saw the condition of women with infants, that was astonishingly better than you would have ever expected. Why? Because they found ways to help each other. It immediately took me to Khatchig's research on humanitarian resistance and how in 1915, when Armenians were being deported to the deserts where there was no chance for survival, one might think. And that's what the Ottoman government had planned for. Thousands of Armenians survived because of the same reason, that they were helping each other. They were creating these networks of assistance, of food supplies, of medical supplies. They would find doctors who would come secretly and help deliver babies and save lives. And that is why I echo your statement that the resilience and the perseverance of Armenian people gives us the hope that, yes, the families will thrive. And as Armine said, hopefully one day back in their fatherland, in their homeland. I also wanted to bring our audience's attention to something that also is a parallel between the past and today, which Kim, you mentioned about the 1988 earthquake and the post-80s pogrom Armenians who came to Armenia, and what worked and what didn't work for refugees. Again, on my own research, I found that when the refugees from provinces of Ottoman Empire would survive and move to the Caucasus, then Russian Empire, future to become Republic of Armenia, the ones that were to survive had more chance to succeed, were the ones that were kept together as communities, were the ones that were provided the opportunity to work, to earn, and the ones whose dignity wasn't affected by the decisions made from the top. Some of the refugees would actually fight for an opportunity to choose what to eat and not to be given the ratio of the food that was assigned from somewhere in the top, and not considering their own needs. So I want to thank all of our panelists and our audience. Our audience members were also reacting right after Armine's presentation and asking me to tell you, Armine, that it was profoundly moving to hear your story and to learn about your experience. And I know that we don't have a lot of time, but since we asked you to be brief, I know that there were certain moments that you didn't really share with us, but that were unbelievable in the experiences of some of your family members who were there during the war. I believe it was one of your either brothers or cousins that survived miraculously. Would you mind sharing that story, please?
Yeah, two of my brothers were in war at a time in 2020 and also in this time. And there were some stories with my brothers. It was a war naturally, and lots of people were in blockade. But one of my brothers survived a blockade. The land where they were kept was surrounded by enemies, and he survived. And the other brother also survived the war because he had his ring on his finger, and when he tapped his hands after washing them, and the ring fall down, and when he wanted to pick it up, the bumped bumped where he was standing. And also this time, I didn't mention in my speech that there was also after the war this gas explosion that took a lot of lives as well. So my two brothers were there as well. So thank God they are alive. and nothing happened to them because so many people lost their lives, their loved ones. That is unbelievable. So I say every time, thank God that after our father, he didn't take my brothers, and this I will mention as a miracle stories, I will say.
Thank you, Armine. Yes, and for our audience who might not be familiar, there was a huge gas explosion at one of the gas stations where people were in long lines trying to, fuel their vehicles to be able to move. And many people died there, and it was a horrible scene. It was another catastrophe on top of everything else that was happening to Artsakh Armenians who were being displaced. So it is indeed a miracle to survive that, and thank you for sharing that. And if any of our panelists have any questions or comments to add, because we are restricted in time, this would be a good opportunity for you.
I would like to ask Kim to say a few words about the explosion. I do think it's such a central part of the Exodus, and a lot of what I know about it and the damage and the horrors that has been caused, I've actually learned from Kim.
I can only talk about the aftermath in Yerevan, so I can what I think, Khatchig, what you're asking, and we've talked about this before, is that as Asya said, so for the audience, I will say that this is all happening in September. People are packing up. As Armina says, she's in her living room trying to decide what to take and what can they fit in the car. And there was this rumor that went around you could only take one bag of things, that they were doing this checkpoint and they wouldn't let you take stuff out, and it was chaos. And so having not had fuel in the area for 3 months, they were given a bolus of fuel so that they could fuel up and get out. And this was planned. But unfortunately, as everybody lined up and they were getting this fuel, it was just a chaotic situation. There was a spark and there was a huge explosion. And unfortunately, somewhere around 200 people died, but many, many people survived, but with terrible burns. And so the Ministry of Health had wanted to have a more robust public health response to receive the refugees, but it turned out that all of their attention really at the highest levels was on figuring out and negotiating, getting helicopters into this area to pull out the victims of this catastrophic explosion and bring them to the burn center. The burn center in Armenia is very low resourced, and typically they have 1, 2, 3, 4 people in a given month. And all of a sudden they had hundreds of people. And it was a catastrophe that to this day, there are people still trying to survive that. It really did take over the health response in a way, I think, that undermined the public health response. I think that's what you're alluding to, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Khatchig and Kim. And we also have a question from our audience to Armine, asking her if she would mind sharing her experience of transitioning to life in Armenia. Would you like to talk about that, Armine?
Thank you for the question. It's a question that I don't have an answer so far, because lots of people ask me whether I feel comfortable here or not. To be honest, I feel comfortable, but not in the sense I feel comfortable at home, because home is one. You have one home, and here they are Armenians. They speak Armenian, but I will say I will miss my home, my land a lot. So for older generation, it's a little bit problematic to get used back to the life. But for example, for children, it's more easy to go with all this. For example, one of my boys goes to school. First year, he's a first year. He's in first class, and he feels comfortable, to be honest, here, and I'm very happy for him. And the other, my middle son, he's in kindergarten, and he also feels comfortable. But when it comes to people of my age and the older generation, it's more complicated than it seems to be. So that's it.
Thank you, Armine. We also have a question that I guess is both for Armine and Kim. It's about whether or not there is a need for nutritional intervention among children and babies who were in the blockade or in their mother's womb while, the blockade was happening and to help, compensate for the losses. Or did the community resources sharing work so well that there is no need for such an intervention? And if there is a need, are there any initiatives taking place in Armenia to help those in need?
I'll speak in general, and then Armine, I'm really interested in your experiences and opinion on this. So, so while we didn't see, and this is not exhaustive research, right? But we think that there was triaging that went on in such a way that we didn't see the kinds of severe micronutrient deficiencies that we thought we would see coming out. But now these may start, right? So now the issue of food insecurity may start or continue from the blockade, in the sense that people are now refugees, right? So without employment, without permanent housing, without transportation, without certain structural things in place, there's a risk that food insecurity will now, in fact, have those kinds of health impacts on the pregnant women. And in fact, there is a program that has been started by the Fund for Armenian Relief. There's fundraising from St. Leon's Church here in New Jersey, and through the Fund for Armenian Relief and the group, the Mom Center, that I showed a sort of clip on one of the slides, to contact all of the women who are pregnant or were pregnant during this transition, to contact them as best we can find them, and to offer them support, to do a needs assessment on whether or not they are experiencing food insecurity, and mostly to counsel on nutrition and nutrition in resource low settings. So what is cheap but high in nutrients and sufficient to bring a healthy baby into this world? So I would be curious, Armine, if you get a sense that your nutrition, or your community's nutrition, or women who you know in your community who are having children, if you feel that nutrition is something that is an issue that should be highlighted.
Thank you for the question. I will speak first during the blockade. During the blockade, it was, as you mentioned, resource sharing. So one had something. One had baby formulas, one had diapers, one had pills, antibiotics, and the people were posting it on social media, for example, asking, do you have this kind of pills or antibiotics that we need? And women system where all sharing with each. And also about the nutrition, where it came, I said that the public transportation through Stepanakert and rural villages parts of Artsakh stopped, and that meant that a lot of agricultural products were not coming to Stepanakert. So what was found in Stepanakert also for me, I will speak in my name. I was first taking account in my colleagues, relatives who was pregnant, who had small kids like me. So this resource sharing was working well enough. Of course, there were lots of pills, lots of needs that even in case we wanted to fund, but there was a lot of absence of this kind of products. And about I missed the second part. Did
Today, yeah, today.
Today, I won't say that there is a need for nutrition or for some kind of another assistance. I guess the only problem is that, for example, women that are pregnant now care the results of what was before. The malnutrition, the vitamins that were not taken from natural foods, and stuff like that. But today in Armenia, you can find
if you have the money to do so and the knowledge to do so. So I would agree.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for addressing the questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so allow me to thank our wonderful speakers today. Khatchig, Kim, thank you for your expertise. Armine, thank you for trusting us with your story and presenting it publicly for the first time to Chhange's audience today. Thank you to our audience for joining this program on the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day and for all your questions. And my apologies if we did not manage to address all of them. Allow me to thank once again everyone who helped us put together this program. Suzanne, Rachel, thank you for helping with the Zoom. Our program supporters, Adrian and Richard Moncomber, thank you so much. Our sponsors, our donors, our members, we are so grateful for your generosity and support. Until our next meeting virtually or a Chhange in person, have a good night.